It's a good time to introduce our Examine an Expert round. Our two experts this week to help us find out where all the money went are, from the Financial Times, journalist and author of the book Fool's Gold, Gillian Tett, and economic correspondent and presenter of the Keiser report on Russia Today, Max Keiser. OK, Gillian, you have to deal with all these figures day in, day out. I mentioned a figure of $210 trillion of debt. Is that right? Does that figure sound right to you?
That is indeed right. And in fact, there's another figure which is even bigger.
What?
Which is the amount of derivatives, and that's nearer $600–700 trillion.
So, derivatives, so there's an even bigger bubble outside the bubble.
Absolutely. It's like taking a piece of sugar, which is a bit of money, and creating all these new contracts in the market on the back of it and spinning that sugar round and round and round until it becomes a great big puff like candy floss. And that's all the derivatives that are attached to that money.
All this debt, have we ever been in a situation like this before?
Basically, history goes through two phases. You either have money existing like gold coins, tangible things that are in short supply, or you have virtual money that people create that's kind of like monopoly money, imaginary money, that there's no constraint on just how big that money can be.
Why are we drowning in debt? Where's it all come from?
Well, there used to be a constraint as to how much money could be created, and that was the gold standard. And essentially, central banks could only create money that matched the gold. That was abandoned about 5 decades ago, and so now there is no constraint. I mean, if you go back to, say, ancient Mesopotamia, you had the same problem, back in Babylon, where essentially people used to create these contracts, which were essentially forms of debt, and there was no constraint there. And back then, the situation used to get so bad that when the debt bubble exploded, the rulers used to forgive the debts because they knew if they didn't do that, then they'd have riots. I mean, the original phrase of wiping the slate clean actually goes back to Babylon, where they literally wiped the slate clean that marked all the debts that were held in the population.
That's an idea. Max,
I think the Greeks would love it.
They would. Well, they know how to make a drachma out of a crisis, don't they? Max, sorry. Max, you describe yourself as a financial war reporter. The fact that you're in the United Kingdom kind of suggests that we might be the front line. Are things pretty bad?
Yeah. So I was in Greece before it collapsed. I was in Iceland before it collapsed. Now I'm in London before it collapses.
We're in deep trouble. Deep trouble. So how does the debt break down in this country? I mean, how big is the bank debt at the moment, for example?
Well, you have estimates anywhere between 400% of GDP to 5 or sometimes 600% of GDP, and the numbers get quite outrageous. But when you think about this global debt pile of hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivative, I mean, give you an idea, just one bank, for example, it's not a UK bank, but a JP Morgan, their derivative share is something like $90 trillion in derivatives. Now, that's bigger than the entire GDP of the world. So here's one bank with more debt and derivatives than the entire global GDP.
And that's the one that Tony Blair works for, isn't it?
Tony?
Yeah, you thought I was stupid. I think. But all this sort of derivatives debt, it's quite complicated. I mean, you know, how can you explain this sort of financial system? I mean, we can explain it in Lehman's terms, but how do you explain it in layman's terms?
One of the problems is that if you're putting pennies into a jar, you can count them and you can see them. When you're dealing with quadrillions, it's also imaginary. You can't really understand how the financial system works. And central bankers and economists have this model of the financial system being like a plumbing system. You pour in water in one end of the plumbing system and it goes through the pipes and comes out the other. The problem today is that the system's so complex, many of those pipes have actually burst, they've broken, they've got blockages in. People can't see that until they pour the water in one end of the system and it either doesn't come out the other end, or the pipes burst, or they have a backflow and you have a very nasty mess.
If I can build on that analogy, I think of it as for irrigation, if you will. You know, the water is supposed to come in and be irrigating the fields. But the irrigation system has been re-engineered. You notice that the Times list of the richest in the UK went up sharply, whereas those in the middle and the bottom are losing quite a bit. That's because the financial engineers at the irrigation system of money flooding into the system, somehow it went into one way and watered one area of the crops. The other area are now barren and desertification has set in. I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah, so you're saying at some level this is a con trick, this is a fraud, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Where did the money go? It quite simply was stolen.
So where's it ended up?
In the pockets of the highest echelons. They're not suffering one bit. Their net worth, their wealth is increasing substantially.
The real con game is to make sure that you keep shuffling the cards fast enough that no one actually notices the con game.
Right, prices go up, but not wages. That's a key. In the past, when you've had money enter the system and you have quote-unquote inflation, you would have wage inflation and price inflation. But here you have asset inflation and wage stagnation. So that's where the gap is widening because wages are up 1%, inflation is up officially by 2.8%, so there's no taxable income being generated, there's no growth in the taxes coming in from wages, and yet that money keeps pouring into the system and going into those asset prices that are owned by a very, very few percentage of the population.
And meanwhile, houses in Kensington go up by 20% or more.
That's extraordinary. You've no idea how much I wish I understood all that. I understood the last bit, but not the first. But you deal with this all the time, but yet even in the way that you describe it, it's a kind of madness. I mean, where is this all leading? How is it going to end?
Well, history suggests that debt bubbles end in one of two ways. You either have some form of social implosion, a war, some kind of revolution, or you essentially have a explicit or implicit default. That debt just doesn't get paid back, it gets cancelled. And you can do that through inflation, you can do that through an explicit debt forgiveness program, or you can just have people defaulting. Occasionally, if you're very lucky, you have a lot of growth, and that enables a country to grow its way out of the debt, but that's pretty rare. And right now, given the scale of the debt, and given just how slow growth is, the chance of having growth solve the problem is pretty low.
Why are people getting away with it, Max? Surely, I mean, is there not something...
Because there's no deterrent. There's nothing in the criminal justice system that deters financial fraud and larceny on this scale at the moment. Because every financial crisis that's happened in the past 20 or 30 years, the outcome has been that the bankers have been very good at lobbying governments to pass new laws to make it easier to commit financial crime. Now they've achieved a state of nirvana where they can commit financial crime with impunity. Now, the two outcomes that Gillian is talking about, I think the most likely will be inflation. They'll try to inflate their way out of the debt. We're going to print a lot of money. This is the scandal going forward, Rory, is that a year from now, the government will say the debt is less as a percentage to GDP than it was the year before. How did you get there? Well, we unleashed the money printers and we caused inflation. Now, everyone here is going to be paying more for food and energy. Their lives will be downgraded, but the government will say, but the debt's a smaller percentage of the GDP. So that's the illusion that they're going to put forward next year. That's next year's scandal.
Or else you go back to Babylon and just wipe the slates clean.
That's an idea. There we go. There's the solution. You heard it here first. Thank you, Gillian Tett. Thank you, Max Keiser.